Today's lesson takes us into chapter 21, section 3, which is focused on the 30 Years War in the central portion of Europe. It basically is a war between France and Austria with some supporting bodies there. You could also say it was a war between two ruling families, the Hapsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of France. This comes into play in the aftermath of the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Lutheran and Catholic princes wanted to watch each other closely, even though they had struck an agreement back in the Peace of Augsburg. They both felt threatened by a new Protestant faction called Calvinism, which was becoming popular in Germany and other parts of northwestern Europe. Eventually, the Protestant Lutherans and Calvinists joined forces in what's called the Protestant Union in 1608. The Catholics, in counter to this, formed what's called the Catholic League. One thing that took place were the Bohemian Protestant rebellions. These broke out in 1618. Ferdinand II was the Hapsburg ruler of what we call the Czech Kingdom of Bohemia. He was definitely a Catholic. Bohemian Protestants, they didn't trust Ferdinand, and therefore, because of other factors, they revolted. Ferdinand sent an army into Bohemia to crush the rebellion, and this basically kicks off what's known as the 30 Years War, a conflict over religion, territory, and power among European ruling families lasting from 1618 to 1648, hence the term 30 Years War. There really are two main phases of the 30 Years War. The Habsburg triumphs, this is the time period in the early part when the Habsburgs are winning, and the Habsburg defeats, this is the second or latter half of the war when they started to lose. The Habsburg triumphs is where we will start. During the initial 12 years of the war, Habsburg armies from Austria and Spain were defeating Protestant troops in most battles. They stopped the Czech revolt and the German Protestants who supported it also. Eventually, though, the tides of the war would turn by about 1630 and shifted into the Protestants' favor. The Protestant ruler Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden led an army of 23,000 men against the Habsburg armies. He had some success until he was killed in battle in 1632. The French cardinals, Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin, who we learned about in section 2, played their roles for France in the war as well. Despite being Catholic, they actually sided with the Protestants. Why do the Catholic cardinals of France want to side with the Protestants? Well, it's really becoming more about powerful family ruling bodies like Bourbon family versus Habsburg family and political factors than it is about religion for them. It all ends in the Peace of Westphalia. Germany suffered the most from this war by means of a reduced population and economic turmoil. The Peace of Westphalia ends the war in 1648, and the consequences of this war can be seen on page 604. Here we have some of the major consequences of the 30 Years' War, which ended in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. You have a weakening of the Habsburg states of Spain and Austria, who were already on the decline as well. France, because they joined the winning side essentially, they were strengthened and they were awarded parts of German territory. German princes became independent of the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. It ended basic religious wars in Europe. This was really the last major religious war within European boundaries. And it also introduced a new method of peace negotiation at the Peace of Westphalia, whereby all participants who were in the war would meet and settle the problems. This method is generally still used today. Okay, this did lead into the beginning of modern states. The most important result from the 30 Years' War was that Europe became recognized as a group of independent states or countries. This also ended the Catholic concept of a large empire ruled by the Pope over a large portion of Europe. Now, one of the things that we'll take a look at next is definitely going to be how some of these early states form in Central Europe. Many of these early areas became known as the Central European powers, such as Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, which became Germany, and then also the Ottoman Empire. The states developed faster in Western Europe because serfs earned freedom and ended feudalism earlier there. In Central European areas, they were still practicing feudalism. There were some weak empires too. Nobles of Central European empires attempted to limit the power of kings. The Ottoman Empire went into a state of decline, and then eventually the Holy Roman Empire was devastated by the 30 Years' War. This all led to Austria, even though they lose a major portion of this, growing in strength. The Habsburgs of Austria attempted to gain power in Central Europe because of the weaknesses of others. They wanted to develop what's called an absolute monarchy. And really, they established a monarchy in three ways. Number one, they reconquered the region of Bohemia and wiped out Protestantism there. Number two, they were centralizing the government and developed a standing army. And then number three, they reconquered Hungary, which was at this time in the control of the Ottoman Empire. Charles VI eventually became the Hapsburg ruler in 1711, and he united Austria, Hungary, and the Bohemian Empire into one entity. Then we have a key leader named Maria Theresa, who inherited the Austrian throne. Maria Theresa was Charles VI's oldest daughter, as she inherited the Hapsburg throne. Next, we'll take a look at a group that rises to challenge Austria, which was Prussia. We'll talk about the rise of Prussia. Another ruling family has entered. They were called the Hohenzollerns. And Frederick William was the first great ruler. They called their rulers the Great Elect early on. He believed that the only way to strong rule was through the army. He created an army of 80,000 men, which would become a Prussian masterpiece, and they always focused on military power. He also introduced permanent taxation to pay for these military men. A group in Prussia were called the Junkers. They were Prussian nobles that actually resisted the king's power. We always see a power play between kings and nobles. Then we have Frederick the Great, who was Frederick William's son. His father worried that he wasn't really militaristic enough to rule effectively. He loved music, philosophy, and poetry. Eventually, though, he would become known as Frederick II, and then eventually known as Frederick the Great, who followed his father's militaristic policies, but also practiced religious tolerance and reduced the amount of laws and restrictions on the people within Prussia. Then we have what's called the War of Austrian Succession. This is a war that took place between Prussia and Austria. It was over a region. It was between Frederick II and Maria Theresa. Frederick thought that he could bully Austria because they had a female ruler. He wanted to invade and take over the Austrian province called Silesia, and therefore invaded it in 1740. Maria Theresa sought help from Hungarians, who promised to provide an army, and other groups got involved as well. This ended up being Austria and Great Britain versus Prussia and France. Prussia wins out in the end, and they took over what's called the province of Silesia in 1748. The reason that everybody wanted Silesia was it was rich in iron ore, textiles, and also food products. Then we have also the 7 Years' War, which was kind of the opposite. It had a reversal of allies. In the Americas, this is called the French and Indian War. But here in this war, you have Austria, France, and Russia teaming up versus Great Britain and Prussia. This was known as the 7 Years' War. It was a war between the two alliances that fought from 1756 to 1763 in Europe, India, and also North America.